The wind reached the ridge before dawn, slipping through the spruce and stone with a low, steady breath. It carried the smell of snow and old rock. The woman was already awake when it arrived. Her name was Eliza Calder, and she lived alone where the mountain folded inward, high above the river valley. The cabin she had built stood narrow and stubborn against the slope, its logs darkened by years of weather. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, not because the fire was strong, but because the air was too cold to disturb it. Eliza stood outside with her wool coat buttoned to her throat, one gloved hand resting on the rough rail she had set beside the steps. She did not hurry back inside. She watched the mountain wake. Below her, the valley was still dim, the river a pale line beneath frost. Farther down, scattered cabins clung to flatter ground, where the soil was easier and the walking kinder. Most of those families had arrived after Eliza. They had chosen convenience over height, shelter over patience. She had chosen neither. She had chosen stone. Eliza had come to the mountain in the autumn of 1853, alone, with a mule, a cart, and the tools her father had taught her to use before fever took him 2 winters earlier. She had not come looking for neighbors. She had come looking for permanence. The first cabin she built was ordinary by every measure. Pine logs from the lower forest, clay chinking mixed with straw, a shallow stone hearth. It took her most of the autumn, working until her hands cracked and bled. By the time the first snow came, she had a roof and walls and a door that closed. It was enough to survive. It was not enough to endure. The first winter taught her that lesson slowly, then all at once. The cold did not come in a single storm. It came in layers, nights that bit harder than expected, mornings where the water skin stiffened, days where the sun rose pale and offered no warmth in return. Eliza burned wood until her arms ached from splitting. She sealed every gap she could find. She slept wrapped in blankets with her boots beside her so they would not freeze solid by morning. Even then, the cold found its way inside. It crept up from the floor. It pressed down from the roof. It stole heat the moment the fire weakened. She survived that winter by attention and stubbornness alone. Others did not fare as well. By the second winter, more families had moved into the valley. They built quickly, following the same patterns Eliza once had. Flat ground, 4 walls, roofs heavy with sod, chimneys that bled heat into the sky. When the cold came early that year, it came without apology. The river froze thick enough to walk across. The snow did not melt between storms. Wood piles shrank faster than expected. Smoke hung over the valley day and night. Eliza watched from her slope as lanterns moved between cabins at odd hours. She heard shouting carried thin by the wind. Once, she saw a family hauling furniture toward the communal barn near the river, hoping shared bodies and shared fire might keep them warm. Her own cabin held, barely. She fed the fire constantly. She did not sleep more than an hour at a time. The walls groaned at night as the logs tightened in the cold. When spring finally came, it came with loss written quietly across the valley. No one spoke of it directly. They never did. They repaired what they could. They planted again. They told themselves it had been an unusually harsh season. Eliza did not tell herself that. She told herself the truth. The truth was that the mountain did not care how people had always built. The truth was that the stone around her behaved differently than the wood she kept trying to master. She noticed it first while repairing a fence line above her cabin. The sun had been strong that afternoon, bright enough to soften the snow's crust. When evening came, the air cooled quickly, but the rock face beside her remained warm under her palm. Not hot, not even truly warm, but steady. She returned after dark with a lantern and pressed her hand to the stone again. The warmth lingered. Over the following weeks, she paid attention. She found shallow hollows in the cliff where snow never quite settled. She noticed that the mountain goats sheltered beneath overhangs during storms, emerging dry while the trees dripped ice. She sat beneath a wide stone lip one evening and felt the air there hold its temperature long after the open slope had turned bitter. Eliza did not talk about these observations. She wrote them down instead, marking times and temperatures with a careful hand. She moved her thermometer from open ground to stone shade, from cabin wall to cliff hollow, and compared the numbers. The pattern was undeniable. Stone absorbed heat slowly. Stone released it slowly. Wood did neither. By midsummer, she had chosen her site. It lay a short climb above her existing cabin, where the mountain curved inward to form a broad alcove facing south. The overhang stretched far enough to block rain and snow. The back wall rose smooth and pale, marked with long mineral seams. The floor sloped gently toward the opening, dry even after storms. She stood there one afternoon with her pack at her feet and knew, with the calm certainty she trusted most, that this was where she would build again. When she told the valley, the reaction was immediate and predictable. "You're building into the mountain?" one man asked, squinting as though he had misheard. "Against it," Eliza corrected. "With it," another shook his head. "That's not a proper house. That's a cave. The mountain's been standing longer than any of our cabins," she replied. "I trust it." Some laughed. Others frowned with concern, thinly disguised as judgment. A few said nothing at all, watching her as though waiting for proof of foolishness. No one offered help. Eliza did not ask. She began in early autumn, while the days were still long. The first task was the floor. She hauled stone from a talus field below the ridge, selecting flat pieces that locked together with patience rather than force. She leveled the slope inch by inch, creating a platform wide enough for a single-room dwelling. She cut shallow channels along the edge so any water would run outward, not in. The work was slow. Her shoulders burned at night. Her hands stiffened each morning. She learned to pace herself, to stop before exhaustion stole precision. Next came the foundation logs. She stripped them clean and shaped their undersides to meet stone instead of soil. She drilled holes into the rock itself and set iron pins she had forged the winter before, anchoring the logs so they could not shift. 3 walls only. The back wall was already there. Fitting wood to stone demanded more care than any corner joint she had ever cut. Each log had to be shaped to meet the cliff's irregular face. Gaps were sealed with clay, fiber, and resin, pressed deep and smoothed by hand. When the wind blew through the alcove, it carried no draft where wood met rock. By the time the walls reached shoulder height, word had spread again. "She's half finished," someone said. "She'll regret it come snow." Eliza worked on. The heating system came next, and with it the true heart of her design. Instead of setting the hearth away from the mountain, she built it directly against the stone, using fire brick to protect the surface while allowing heat to pass into the mass beyond. A natural crack in the cliff rose straight above the hearth, narrow and deep. She cleaned it carefully and fitted her flue to meet it, sealing every seam. When she lit the first test fire, she sat quietly and watched. The stone warmed beneath her palm. Not quickly, not dramatically, but it held. By the time the roof was finished and the door hung heavy and tight, the first snow was already dusting the ridge. Eliza moved her belongings up the slope in careful loads, leaving the old cabin empty and unregretted. That first night, she built a modest fire and let it burn down before sleep. Outside, the temperature fell hard. Inside, the stone did its work. Eliza woke before dawn, not from cold, but from stillness. The air held steady around her. The walls did not creak. The floor did not steal heat from her feet. She touched the stone beside her bed and felt warmth lingering from the day before. She smiled once, quietly. Winter had not yet arrived in full, but when it did, the mountain would be ready, and so would she. Winter did not announce itself all at once. It advanced the way mountains prefer patiently, with small claims made permanent. The first storm came in late autumn, light and dry, more suggestion than threat. Snow sifted into the valley and vanished by afternoon. Eliza Calder watched it from her alcove doorway, noting how the stone above her kept the air still while the wind worried at the open slope beyond. That night, She did not light a fire at all. The warmth stored in the cliff carried her through until morning. That was when she knew the mountain was no longer an experiment. It was a partner. As the weeks passed, the storms grew heavier. Snow no longer melted between falls. The river below slowed and dulled, its surface glazing over at the edges. Smoke from valley chimneys thickened, rising straight up on cold mornings before flattening under low cloud. Eliza settled into routine. Each day followed the same quiet structure. She rose before sunrise, checked the thermometer outside the alcove, then the one inside near the back wall. She recorded the numbers carefully, not because she intended to show them to anyone, but because truth mattered when memory softened hardship. She built one fire each day, always at the same hour, when the sun reached deepest into the alcove. She fed it steadily for several hours, then let it die. The stone absorbed the heat without complaint. By evening, the interior remained warm enough that she worked without gloves. At night, she slept wrapped lightly, the cliff radiating its stored warmth like a slow breath. Below her, the valley burned constantly. Eliza could see it from the ridge, fires never allowed to fade, smoke drifting even in daylight, men hauling sleds stacked with wood from farther and farther upstream. She saw arguments too, gestures sharp even at distance. Wood was becoming a measure of survival, and some had less than others. She did not go down often, but when she did, the contrast was stark. Inside the valley cabins, the air was sharp and uneven. Heat pooled near ceilings while floors froze. Walls sweated frost that melted and refroze with every shift in fire strength. People spoke loudly, not from cheer, but from the strain of cold, tightening voices. They asked her questions now, not mocking ones. How warm does it stay? How much wood do you burn? Does the rock ever crack? She answered honestly. She showed them her hands unburned, unchapped compared to winters past. She invited a few inside, one at a time, letting them feel the difference without explanation. Some nodded slowly. Others frowned, unwilling to accept what their bodies told them. The real test came after the new year. The sky turned brittle and pale. Wind scoured the ridge until the trees sang. The thermometer outside Eliza's alcove dropped lower than it had the year before. She marked the numbers without comment, her handwriting steady. The cold settled in and refused to leave. Days passed where the sun offered only light, not warmth. Nights stretched long and iron-hard. Snow stacked against doors and fences until paths disappeared entirely. The river froze solid across its width, groaning under its own weight. Eliza adjusted nothing. Her routine remained the same. One fire, careful timing, stone warmed, stone held. On the fourth night of the cold snap, she woke to a sound she had not heard from the alcove before, shouting. It drifted up the slope, broken by wind, a human sound, raw and urgent. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside. Lantern light flickered far below, moving unevenly through the snow. She waited only a moment before acting, tying her boots and lighting her own lamp. The descent was slow and dangerous. Snow hid rocks and roots. The cold bit hard at her face. By the time she reached the edge of the valley, her breath burned in her chest. A group of people stood near one of the smaller cabins, clustered tight. Someone was crying. Someone else argued in a hoarse voice. The cabin's chimney smoked weakly. Inside, the air was barely warmer than outside. The firebox glowed, but the heat fled upward as fast as it was made. A woman sat on a low stool, her hands wrapped around a pot of water that refused to steam. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "She won't stop shaking," a man said, his voice cracking. "We've burned nearly everything." Eliza did not hesitate. "Bring her," she said. "Now." They stared at her, confused. She did not explain. Two men lifted the woman carefully, wrapping her in blankets stiff with frost. Eliza led the way, her lantern carving a narrow path through the dark. The climb was brutal. The wind rose higher on the slope, tearing at clothing and breath alike. More than once, someone stumbled, nearly falling. Eliza set the pace, slow but relentless, stopping only when the woman's breathing grew too shallow. When they reached the alcove, Eliza opened the door and warm air spilled out into the night. It felt like stepping into another season. They carried the woman inside and laid her on the sleeping platform against the stone wall. Eliza added a small fire not for heat, but for reassurance, and set water to warm. The woman's shaking slowed almost immediately, her breath evening as the stone did its quiet work. No one spoke for a long time. They sat or stood wherever there was space, faces lit by firelight and reflected stone. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Outside, the cold ruled absolutely. Inside, the air held steady, calm, forgiving. "This isn't right," someone whispered at last. Not in accusation, in awe. Eliza met his eyes. "It's just different." They stayed until morning. No one slept much, but no one shivered either. When dawn came pale and cold, the woman on the platform stirred and asked for water in a steady voice. They left quietly, gratitude heavy and unspoken. The valley changed after that night. People began climbing the slope during daylight, not in crisis, but with questions sharpened by experience. They measured the alcove with their eyes. They touched the stone. They watched how little wood Eliza carried inside. Some were still skeptical. Tradition dies slowly, especially when pride is involved, but others were already searching the cliffs for their own answers. The cold did not relent. A larger storm followed, worse than the last. Wind drove snow sideways for days. Drifts buried fences completely. Valley cabins went dark one by one as wood ran out or chimneys iced over. Eliza received more visitors then. Families huddled together in her single room, careful and quiet. She did not turn anyone away. She adjusted her fire schedule slightly, extending the burn to account for more bodies, more breath, but the stone absorbed it all without protest. Her alcove became a place of survival. Word spread beyond the valley. Travelers who had planned to pass through stayed instead, drawn by warmth and rumor. They told stories of other settlements struggling, of people abandoning cabins and moving on. One evening, as the storm finally began to break, a man Eliza recognized as one of the loudest skeptics stood near her door, hat in his hands. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought you were hiding." She looked at him, then at the stone wall glowing faintly with stored heat. "I was listening." By the time spring returned, slow and uncertain, the valley was changed in ways that went beyond snowmelt and broken fences. Some cabins stood empty, abandoned by those who had chosen to leave rather than rebuild. Others bore the scars of desperate winters, split logs, warped doors, chimneys blackened from constant use. Above them all, the alcove remained steady. Eliza watched the thaw from her doorway, the mountain shedding winter without hurry. Below her, people worked with new purpose. They looked up more often now, not just at her dwelling, but at the stone itself. The mountain had taught her first. Now it was teaching them, and the next winter would not find her alone. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in negotiations. Snow withdrew from the south-facing slopes first, shrinking back from stone that had already begun to warm. Meltwater traced careful paths down the mountain, feeding the river below without flooding it. The valley stirred back to life, slower than before, more cautious. Eliza Calder remained where she was. She did not hurry to the valley when the cold loosened its grip. She stayed in the alcove and listened to the mountain change tone. Stone that had held heat now released it into air that no longer needed protection. The difference was subtle, but she felt it. The partnership had shifted from endurance to balance. Her routine softened. Fires grew smaller. Some days, she did not light one at all. The interior stayed cool enough to work comfortably even as the sun strengthened. When summer finally asserted itself, the alcove did what it had promised in the opposite season, shielding her from heat just as faithfully as it had from cold. Visitors returned, but they came with tools this time. The first was Thomas Reed, a man who had nearly lost his family during the worst of the winter. He climbed the slope with a measured pace, stopping often to study the rock around him. When he reached Eliza's door, he did not ask for shelter. He asked for instruction. They sat at the work table she had built against the side wall. Eliza laid out what she had learned, not as theory, but as sequence. Orientation first, overhang depth, stone quality, drainage, patience. Most mistakes happen before the first log is cut, she told him. Thomas listened without interruption. When he left, he carried no plans drawn on paper. He carried understanding instead. By midsummer, the sound of work echoed across the cliffs. Eliza could hear it even when she did not look, the ring of hammer on stone, the scrape of logs being shaped to meet uneven rock. Smoke rose from test fires in new alcoves, thin and tentative. Not everyone succeeded. One man chose a shallow recess that trapped moisture. His floor stayed damp despite effort. He abandoned the site before winter returned. Another built too close to the opening, failing to take full advantage of the stone's mass. His cabin performed better than those in the valley, but not well enough to inspire confidence. Eliza did not interfere. Failure was part of learning. The mountain did not reward shortcuts. Those who listened, who observed before building, fared better. By early autumn, 4 new alcove dwellings stood along the ridge, each different, each shaped by the hand and needs of its builder, but all grounded in the same principles. The valley watched. There was less laughter now, fewer raised eyebrows. Skepticism had given way to something quieter and more difficult reconsideration. When winter returned, it came with familiarity rather than fear. The first storms tested the new structures gently. Snow piled, wind howled, fires were lit and then allowed to fade. People waited, measuring breath against memory. The alcoves held. Not perfectly. Some required adjustments. One needed additional ceiling where wood met stone. Another had misjudged chimney placement and lost more heat than expected, but none failed catastrophically. None drove their occupants back into the valley in desperation. The difference was undeniable. Eliza spent that winter much as she had the last, though with fewer visitors in crisis and more in curiosity. People came to sit with her, to talk quietly beside the stone, to ask about the choices she had made when no one had agreed with them. She answered when asked. She did not preach. Late in the season, a man arrived who did not belong to the valley. He introduced himself as Samuel Hargreave, a surveyor moving through the territory to record settlement patterns and construction methods. He had heard of the alcove dwellings from a trader who had sheltered in one during a storm. "I'd like to see the first," Samuel said. Eliza nodded and led him inside. He measured everything. The depth of the alcove, the thickness of the stone, the distance the sun traveled across the back wall at different times of day. He watched the hearth, felt the warmth radiating from the cliff hours after the fire had died. "This isn't improvisation," he said finally. "It's application." Eliza considered that. "It's attention." Samuel stayed 3 days, observing and recording. He visited the newer dwellings as well, comparing performance and design. When he left, he thanked Eliza formally, as though she had done something extraordinary. She watched him go without ceremony. The winter passed without tragedy. That alone marked it as different. When spring returned again, the valley felt lighter. People repaired cabins not out of desperation, but habit. Children played near the river without being hurried indoors. Fires burned for cooking, not survival. More alcoves were chosen. Eliza did not oversee them all. She could not. The knowledge no longer belonged to her alone. It moved hand to hand, shaped by terrain and need. Some called the structures mountain houses, others simply called them warm. Eliza remained where she was, content. She expanded her own dwelling slightly that summer, carving a narrow storage space deeper into the alcove where the stone curved naturally inward. She added shelves. She improved drainage. The work was careful and unhurried. One evening, As the sun slipped low and the stone began its nightly release of heat, she stood in her doorway and looked down at the valley. Smoke rose gently from several alcoves now, scattered along the ridge like quiet answers. The mountain had not changed. People had, and though Eliza did not seek recognition, she understood something essential as she watched the light fade from stone to shadow. The cold would come again. When it did, fewer would fear it. The mountain aged more slowly than the people who learned from it. Years passed, not marked by calendars but by winters that tested less and summers that asked little. Eliza Calder grew older in the alcove without noticing the change at first. Her hands remained strong, her steps remained sure. Only in quiet moments did she recognize the difference in the way she rested longer after hauling stone, in the way she listened more than she spoke. The valley continued to change. What had begun as quiet curiosity became accepted practice. New families arriving in the region did not build first on the flats. They walked the ridges. They studied stone. They asked questions that would have sounded strange years earlier. Which face gets winter sun? How deep does the overhang need to be? Does the rock hold heat evenly? The answers were no longer Eliza's alone. She watched from her doorway as children grew up considering alcoves normal. They learned to read the mountain the way others learned to read grain or weather. To them, stone was not an obstacle. It was shelter waiting to be understood. Eliza rarely went down to the valley now. When she did, people greeted her with respect that carried no weight of ceremony. She was not a figure of legend. She was simply someone who had listened early. One autumn, a particularly harsh winter was forecast by signs the old-timers recognized: heavy berry sets, animals bedding deeper than usual, early frost in the shadows. The valley prepared calmly. Wood was stored, yes, but not desperately. Fires were planned, not hoarded. When the cold came, it came hard. Wind scoured the slopes. Snow fell thick and relentless. The river froze again, solid and quiet. But there was no panic this time. No midnight shouting. No desperate marches through blizzards. Light glowed steady in alcoves across the ridge. Eliza sat by her hearth, her fire small, her stone wall warm beneath her palm. She did not keep records anymore. She did not need proof. On one of the coldest nights, she woke before dawn and stood outside for a moment, wrapped in her coat. The sky was clear and sharp with stars. The valley lay silent below her, held in cold that no longer frightened anyone. She felt no triumph, only peace. Time continued its work. Eliza's hair silvered. Her movements slowed. She adjusted her life to match, building less, observing more. The mountain remained unchanged, patient as ever. One winter morning, she did not rise before dawn. When neighbors came up the slope later that day, they found her resting on her sleeping platform, the stone wall beside her, still warm from the previous day's fire. The alcove held its quiet as it always had. There was no rush, no alarm. They sat with her for a while, letting the warmth remain what it had always been, a gift freely given by attention and respect. In the years that followed, the alcove was not abandoned. It did not need to be. Others lived there. Others learned from it. The structure aged gently, protected by the same stone that had first made it possible. It required little care. The mountain did most of the work. Long after newer methods arrived, long after people forgot exactly who had built the first dwelling into the cliff, the alcoves remained scattered along the ridge, quiet, practical, enduring. They stood as proof of something simple and easily overlooked. The land had always offered answers. All it had required was someone willing to stop, to watch, and to listen long enough to hear them. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider to hype our video to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.